Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself, leaving you standing in the ruins of what once felt like certainty. For Daniel Garcia, that moment came when he buried his wife Elena and lost his construction job in the same devastating month. Then a letter arrived from a lawyer he'd never met, telling him about a great aunt he'd never heard of, who left him a crumbling hotel in the forgotten mountain town of Ravens Peak. The townspeople laughed at him for accepting it. They said the Whitmore Grand Hotel was cursed. They said nobody who stayed there kept their sanity. But Daniel had his 9-year-old daughter Luna, nowhere else to go, and a foreclosure notice that gave him exactly 30 days to find a miracle. What family secret was hidden inside those haunted halls worth $195 million? Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this tale of mystery and redemption moves you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something even more extraordinary waiting for you. The morning Elena died, she'd made Daniel promise her something that would haunt him for months to come. "Don't let Luna grow up afraid of dreaming big," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady beep of life support machines. "Show her that magic still exists in this world, even after the darkest nights." That was 14 months ago, and Daniel hadn't done a very good job keeping that promise. He watched his daughter in the rearview mirror as they drove through the winding mountain roads toward Ravens Peak, their old Toyota packed with everything they owned, which wasn't much. Luna sat quietly with her worn notebook, sketching the passing pine forests with careful strokes of her colored pencils. At 9 years old, she had her mother's expressive dark eyes and creative spirit. But lately, those eyes held a sadness that no child should carry, shadows that had deepened since they'd lost their apartment last week. The job loss had come 6 months after Elena's funeral, 15 years as a construction foreman specializing in historic building restoration, and it all ended with a phone call about economic restructuring and market downturn. The severance package barely covered Elena's medical bills, and their savings had evaporated long before that final night in the hospital when the doctors had run out of options and miracles. Daniel had met Elena during his first major restoration project, a 19th-century courthouse in downtown Sacramento. She was the lead historical researcher, passionate about preserving the stories hidden within old buildings. "Every structure has a soul," she used to say, running her fingers along century-old woodwork. "We're not just fixing buildings, Daniel. We're healing history itself." They'd married in that same courthouse after the restoration was complete, surrounded by the intricate moldings and restored stained glass windows they'd brought back to life together. Luna was born 3 years later, and Elena had filled their small house with the same warmth she brought to her work, attention to detail, respect for the past, and an unshakable belief that broken things could be made whole again. When the cancer came, Elena fought it with the same methodical determination she'd applied to her historical research. She documented every treatment, every setback, every small victory. "I'm not giving up," she'd tell Daniel during the long nights when pain kept her awake. "Luna needs to see that we don't surrender to the hard things." But sometimes the hard things win anyway. The inheritance letter had arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the eviction notice. Daniel almost threw it away, assuming it was another collection agency using legal-sounding language to intimidate him. But something about the letterhead. Morrison and Associates, attorneys at law, Ravens Peak, California, made him pause and actually read the contents. The letter was formal but surprisingly kind, explaining that Esperanza Garcia, Daniel's great-aunt on his father's side, had passed away and left her entire estate to, quote, "the last surviving male heir of the Garcia bloodline." The attorney, Robert Morrison, had included a photograph of the property, a massive Victorian hotel surrounded by towering redwoods and overgrown gardens that had once been meticulously maintained. Daniel had never heard his father mention an Esperanza. His dad had been secretive about family history, always saying the past was mejor dejarlo enterrado, better left buried. But the legal documents were legitimate, and the property was theirs, free and clear, with no liens or outstanding debts. There was just one catch that the lawyer had mentioned almost casually. The Whitmore Grand Hotel had been closed to guests for over 40 years, and the locals considered it problematic. The drive to Ravens Peak took 6 hours through increasingly remote countryside, past small towns that looked like they'd been frozen in time since the 1950s. Luna had barely spoken since they'd loaded their remaining possessions into cardboard boxes that morning. Her notebook was her constant companion now, a way to process feelings she couldn't quite put into words. The drawings had grown more detailed over the past year. Intricate sketches of empty rooms, solitary figures standing in doorways, and always, the recurring image of a grand staircase leading up into darkness. "Are you excited about the new place, Mija?" Daniel asked, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice, though he felt anything but enthusiastic about their uncertain future. Luna looked up from her sketch of mountain peaks. "Will it feel like home?" The question hit him harder than he'd expected. Their little rental house in Sacramento had been home for 8 years, filled with Elena's research books, Luna's artwork taped to the refrigerator, and the comfortable clutter of a family's daily life. This hotel was just a building, 4 walls and a roof that happened to belong to them now. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly, "but maybe we can make it feel like home together." The town of Ravens Peak appeared suddenly around a bend in the mountain road, like something from a forgotten postcard that had been left in a drawer for decades. Main Street stretched for maybe 8 blocks, lined with brick buildings that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1940s. A few locals stood outside Murphy's General Store, their conversations stopping abruptly as the unfamiliar car with out-of-state plates passed by. As they drove through the heart of the small town, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, evaluated, and found wanting. Tomorrow, he knew, they would begin the real adventure of discovering what Esperanza Garcia had left them, and why she'd chosen to leave it to a nephew she'd never met. But tonight, they would rest in the knowledge that they finally had a roof over their heads, even if that roof came with a reputation that made the townspeople cross themselves when they mentioned its name. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Daniel pulled over at Murphy's General Store to ask for directions, though he suspected everyone in a town this small already knew exactly why they were here. The woman behind the counter, maybe 55 with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, looked at him with undisguised curiosity that quickly shifted to concern when he mentioned his destination. "You're not from around here," she observed, not unkindly, but with the wariness of someone who'd seen too many outsiders come and go under unfortunate circumstances. "No, ma'am, I'm looking for the old Whitmore Grand Hotel. I'm Daniel Garcia, inherited it from my great-aunt Esperanza." The general store went dead quiet. The few customers turned to stare, and the woman's expression shifted from simple curiosity to something approaching alarm. Even the old-fashioned radio playing softly in the corner seemed to lower its volume, as if the building itself was listening. "You're actually planning to live there?" An elderly man at the counter shook his head slowly, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup like an anchor. "Son, that place has been empty for 43 years for damn good reason." "What kind of reason?" Daniel asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The woman behind the counter, her name tag read Dorothy, leaned forward conspiratorially. Esperanza Garcia was an unusual woman, kept to herself mostly after the hotel closed, but there were always stories. Lights in the windows when the power had been shut off for decades. Sounds that didn't belong to any living thing. Music playing from the ballroom at 3 in the morning. "Except the piano was destroyed in the fire," the elderly man added ominously, "along with everything else on the 3rd floor." Luna looked up from her notebook, studying the faces of the townspeople with the careful attention she usually reserved for her drawings. "What happened in the fire?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the adult conversation with the directness that only children possess. Dorothy's expression softened when she looked at Luna, but the concern remained. "That was a long time ago, sweetheart. Back in 1980. Some say it was an accident. Old wiring, you know. But others—" She glanced at Daniel meaningfully. "Others say it happened right after some very important guests checked out. Guests who didn't want certain discoveries to become public knowledge." The old man nodded grimly. 3 people died in that fire. Esperanza's brother Miguel, that'd be your great-uncle, I suppose, and 2 others. Investigators never could explain why the fire burned so hot it melted metal, but left some rooms completely untouched, like it knew exactly what it wanted to destroy. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air conditioning. Miguel had other family living there. Business partners, Dorothy corrected carefully. Historians, like your aunt. They were researching something about the hotel's past, something that got them all very excited. And then, she made a gesture that encompassed both the fire and the decades of abandonment that followed. Outside, Luna noticed. The afternoon shadows seemed longer than they should be, stretching across the street like fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. She began sketching the scene, but her pencil kept adding details that weren't actually there. Figures standing in doorways, faces in windows, and always that same grand staircase from her recurring dreams. The directions to the hotel are simple enough, Dorothy said reluctantly, clearly hoping they might change their minds. Continue north on the main road for 5 miles. Turn left at the rusted gate with the Whitmore crest. Follow the gravel drive through the woods until you reach the clearing. But, she hesitated, looking at Luna again. If you're determined to go through with this, at least promise me you'll be careful. That place has a way of getting into people's heads. As they drove away from town, Daniel could see the concerned faces watching them go in his rearview mirror. The weight of their warning settled heavily on the car, mixing with the uncertainty that had been his constant companion since Elena's death. The rusted gate Dorothy had mentioned was almost hidden by overgrown blackberry vines and volunteer saplings that had grown up around the ornate ironwork. The Whitmore family crest, a stylized raven perched on a mountain peak, was barely visible beneath decades of rust and neglect. The gravel road beyond was more pothole than path, forcing Daniel to drive carefully to avoid damaging their already stressed Toyota. Ancient redwoods closed in on both sides, their massive trunks creating a natural cathedral that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into golden shafts. After nearly a mile of careful navigation through the forest, the trees opened into a circular clearing, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The Whitmore Grand Hotel rose before them like something from a Gothic fairy tale. 4 stories of weathered gray stone and dark timber, adorned with intricate Victorian details that had somehow survived decades of neglect. A wraparound veranda sagged under the weight of time, and several windows on the upper floors were boarded over with plywood that had warped and weathered to the color of old bones. But even in its decay, the building possessed an undeniable grandeur. The proportions were perfect, the architectural details carefully crafted by artisans who understood that beauty and function could coexist. This had been a palace once, a destination where the wealthy and powerful had come to escape the pressures of city life. "It's bigger than I expected," Daniel said softly, trying to keep the uncertainty out of his voice. The photograph the lawyer had sent hadn't conveyed the sheer size of the place. Easily 10,000 square feet, maybe more. Luna was staring at the third-floor windows, her notebook forgotten in her lap. "Papa, do you see that?" "See what, mija?" "There's someone in the window, a lady in an old-fashioned dress. She's waving at us." Daniel followed her gaze, but saw only empty glass reflecting the darkening sky. "Probably just the shadows, sweetheart. Old buildings play tricks with the light." But as they climbed the front steps, Luna opened her notebook to a fresh page and began drawing. Not the hotel they were looking at, but a figure in one of the third-floor windows. A woman with kind eyes and elaborate period clothing, her hand pressed against the glass as if trying to reach through it to welcome them home. The front door was solid oak, heavy and ornate, with brass fixtures that had turned green with age but still possessed an elegant dignity. Daniel turned the key the lawyer had given him, half expecting it not to work after all these years. But the lock turned smoothly, as if it had been maintained and oiled regularly despite the hotel's abandonment. The door swung open with a long, mournful creak that seemed to announce their arrival to whatever might be listening in the depths of the building. Inside, dust motes danced in the fading sunlight streaming through tall windows. The entryway was grander than anything Daniel had ever seen. A curved staircase with a carved banister led to the upper floors, and an enormous crystal chandelier hung overhead, many of its pieces missing but still magnificent in its broken beauty. To the left was what had probably been the main lobby and reception area. To the right, a formal dining room with tables that could seat dozens of guests. Straight ahead, Daniel could see into what looked like a grand ballroom, its hardwood floor scarred but intact. "Hello," Daniel called out, feeling foolish but somehow compelled to announce their presence. His voice echoed through the empty rooms, and somewhere in the depths of the hotel, a door creaked in response. Or maybe it was just the building settling after decades of solitude. Luna took his hand, her small fingers warm and reassuring. "It doesn't feel empty," she whispered. And as usual, she was right. Despite 43 years of abandonment, despite the dust and decay and boarded windows, the Whitmore Grand Hotel felt occupied. Not menacing exactly, but watchful, as if it had been waiting patiently for the right people to come home and bring it back to life. Tomorrow, they would begin exploring their inheritance in earnest. Tonight, they would make camp in the least dusty of the first-floor rooms and try to process the magnitude of what they'd taken on. But as evening shadows began to fall across the hotel's grand lobby, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, and that whatever was sharing the space with them was very interested in the new arrivals who carried the Garcia family name. They spent their first night in what had once been the hotel manager's private quarters, a suite of rooms on the ground floor that was in better condition than most of the building. Daniel had found clean linens in a cedar chest that smelled of lavender and thyme, and Luna had claimed the small adjoining room that must have belonged to the manager's child decades ago. The piano music started at exactly 2:17 a.m. Daniel woke to the sound of a classical piece being played with extraordinary skill somewhere in the depths of the hotel. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, something he didn't recognize but that seemed to carry emotions too complex for simple musical notes. He lay still for several minutes listening to the crystalline precision of each phrase, the way the unknown pianist shaped silence and sound into something that made his chest ache with longing for Elena. Luna appeared in his doorway, her dark hair tousled from sleep but her eyes wide and alert. "Do you hear it, Papa? You hear it too?" The relief in his voice was unmistakable. For a moment he'd wondered if grief and stress were finally taking their toll on his sanity. "It's coming from the ballroom. The lady wants us to know she's here." Luna spoke with the matter-of-fact tone she used when discussing the weather or what she wanted for breakfast. They crept through the darkened hallways, following the music toward its source. Daniel used his phone's flashlight to navigate, while Luna seemed to move with uncertainty that suggested she'd walked these halls before, though that was impossible. The ballroom was magnificent, even in its decay. Hardwood floors stretched across a space large enough for 100 couples to dance, while tall windows looked out onto what had once been manicured gardens. At the far end of the room sat a grand piano, its ebony surface dulled by decades of dust but still retaining an elegant dignity. The piano bench was empty. Yet the keys continued to move, depressing and releasing in perfect rhythm as invisible fingers danced across them. The melody grew more complex as they watched, building to crescendos that seemed to shake the very air around them, then falling to whispers that barely disturbed the silence. Daniel approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Hello, is someone there?" The music stopped immediately, the sudden silence more unsettling than the phantom performance had been. Luna walked confidently to the piano and placed her small hands on the keys. When she pressed middle C, the note rang clear and true, perfectly tuned despite decades of abandonment. "She says her name is Victoria Whitmore," Luna announced, as if she'd been having a conversation Daniel couldn't hear. "She used to live here when it was a real hotel. She's been waiting for our family to come home." "How do you know that, Misha?" Luna tilted her head, listening to something only she could hear. "She shows me pictures in my mind. The hotel, when it was beautiful, with ladies in fancy dresses and men in suits dancing right here in this room. She was the owner's daughter, and she loved music more than anything in the world." As if responding to Luna's words, the piano began playing again, but this time the melody was different, lighter, more playful, like the musical equivalent of laughter. Luna clapped her hands in delight and began humming along, somehow knowing a tune she'd never heard before. Daniel examined the piano carefully, looking for any mechanical explanation for what they were witnessing. No player piano mechanism, no hidden speakers or electronic devices. Just an ordinary grand piano that shouldn't have been able to play itself, but was doing exactly that with obvious joy. "Victoria says she's been lonely for a very long time," Luna continued, swaying slightly to the music. "But she's happy we're here because she can tell we understand old things and beautiful things. She says Mama would have loved this place." The mention of Elena hit Daniel like a physical blow. "What does she know about your mother?" Luna was quiet for a moment, her face serious with concentration. "She says people who love beautiful things recognize each other, even across time. And that Mama spirit visits sometimes, to make sure we're okay." The piano music shifted again, becoming something Daniel almost recognized. A lullaby Elena used to hum when Luna was a baby. The melody wrapped around them like a gentle embrace, and for the first time since Elena's death, Daniel felt something approaching peace in the presence of the inexplicable. The next morning brought practical concerns that temporarily pushed supernatural encounters to the background. Daniel spent hours exploring the hotel, taking inventory of what they'd inherited and what needed immediate attention. The building was enormous: 43 guest rooms, a grand dining room, a ballroom, a library, several sitting rooms, and a kitchen that had been designed to feed a small army. Most importantly, he discovered that the basic infrastructure was in remarkably good condition. The electrical system had been updated sometime in the 1970s and was still functional. The plumbing worked, though it took considerable coaxing to get hot water flowing to the upper floors. The heating system was ancient but operational, and someone had clearly been maintaining the roof because there were no signs of water damage, despite decades of mountain weather. Luna spent the morning exploring the hotel's public spaces, her notebook in constant use as she sketched room after room. But Daniel noticed that her drawings included details that weren't actually there: furniture that had long since been removed, decorative elements that existed only in faded rectangles on the wallpaper where they had once hung, and always, people in period clothing who seemed perfectly at home in the surroundings. In the library, they found their first concrete clue about the hotel's mysterious past. The shelves were lined with leather-bound volumes on history, architecture, and what appeared to be genealogical research. Many of the books were annotated in a careful handwriting that Daniel assumed belonged to his great-aunt Esperanza. Luna discovered it first: a brass key hidden behind a row of books about California's gold rush era. The key was ornate, clearly old, with intricate engravings that depicted the same raven and mountain peak motif they'd seen on the front gate. "Victoria says this opens something important," Luna announced, holding up the key. "Something Tia Esperanza wanted our family to find." They spent the rest of the morning testing the key on every lock they could locate. Most of the doors in the hotel stood open or had been secured with modern padlocks that clearly weren't original to the building. But in the hotel's business office, behind a portrait of a stern-looking man in Victorian dress, Luna noticed something that made her gasp with excitement. "Papa, look! The painting is covering something." She was right. When Daniel carefully moved the portrait aside, they found a small safe built into the wall, its brass lock plate decorated with the same raven motif as the key Luna had discovered. The key turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. Inside the safe, they found documents that made Daniel's hands shake as he read them. Property deeds dating back to the 1880s, mineral rights surveys, and, most intriguingly, correspondence between Esperanza Garcia and various historical societies, museums, and government agencies about something called the Whitmore Collection. But it was the photograph tucked between the documents that made Luna clap her hands with recognition. It showed the hotel in its heyday: elegant guests dancing in the ballroom, ladies in elaborate gowns taking tea in the garden, and standing prominently in the center of it all, a young woman in a blue dress who looked exactly like the figure Luna had been drawing since their arrival. "That's Victoria," Luna said excitedly. "But Papa, look at the date on the back." Daniel turned the photograph over and felt his world tilt slightly. The careful notation read, "Victoria Whitmore, summer 1879, age 19, last photograph taken before her disappearance." According to the hotel's records, Victoria Whitmore had vanished without a trace in September 1879, just 3 months before a massive gold discovery on the hotel property had made the Whitmore family one of the wealthiest in California. As if summoned by their discovery, the piano music drifted from the ballroom again, not the joyful melodies of the previous evening, but something sadder, more urgent. Luna took Daniel's hand and led him toward the sound, her notebook clutched tightly in her free hand. "Victoria has been waiting all this time to tell someone what really happened to her," Luna said solemnly. "And she says we need to know the truth before the bad people realize we're here." The afternoon shadows were growing longer as they walked back toward the ballroom, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet exploration of the family inheritance was about to become something much more complicated and potentially dangerous. The hidden room revealed itself purely by accident when Luna dropped her pencil during another of Victoria's piano concerts. As she crawled under the massive instrument to retrieve it, her small fingers encountered something that shouldn't have been there, a section of the ballroom's ornate baseboard that moved when touched. "Papa, there's a button here," she called out, her voice muffled by the piano's bulk. Daniel squeezed under the instrument beside her, his flashlight illuminating what appeared to be a hidden mechanism disguised as decorative woodwork. When Luna pressed it, a section of the ballroom's paneled wall swung inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. "Victoria says this is where Tia Esperanza spent most of her time," Luna announced, emerging from under the piano with dust in her hair but excitement in her eyes. "She says there are wonderful things down there, but also sad things. Things that explain why Victoria could never leave." The staircase was steep and narrow, clearly designed to be discreet rather than convenient. Daniel's flashlight beam revealed walls lined with smooth river stones, and the air that rose from below carried scents of cedar, old paper, and something else, a metallic tang that reminded him of museums and ancient coins. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a vaulted chamber that had been carved directly from the mountain bedrock beneath the hotel. The space was larger than Daniel had expected, perhaps 30 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that his flashlight couldn't reach the upper limits. But it was the contents of the room that made his breath catch in his throat. Display cases lined the walls, each one containing artifacts that gleamed with the distinctive yellow luster of gold. Not raw nuggets or crude mining samples, but finished pieces. Jewelry, ceremonial objects, intricate sculptures, and decorative items that spoke of sophisticated craftsmanship and incredible artistic skill. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, holding what appeared to be a golden mask, its surface covered with symbols that predated any European influence in California. "My God," Daniel whispered, moving from case to case in growing amazement. "This isn't just gold, this is a museum-quality collection of Native American artifacts." Luna had found a modern desk tucked against one wall, its surface covered with research materials, photographs, and what appeared to be correspondence with various academic institutions. The papers were all in his great-aunt's careful handwriting, documenting years of careful study and authentication. "Papa, look at this," Luna said, holding up a letter dated just 6 months before Esperanza's death. It was from the Smithsonian Institution, expressing intense interest in what they called the most significant undiscovered collection of Miwok ceremonial goldwork in existence. Daniel read over her shoulder, his understanding of their situation shifting with each paragraph. The letter discussed preliminary valuations, cultural significance, and the potential for establishing a permanent museum on the hotel property. The estimated value of the collection was staggering. Conservative estimates placed it at over $195 million, with the cultural and historical significance making it truly priceless. But it was the final paragraph that sent chills down Daniel's spine. "We understand your concerns about the Hartwell Corporation's renewed interest in your property. Please be assured that the Smithsonian takes issues of cultural preservation very seriously, and we are prepared to provide legal support to ensure this collection remains protected from commercial exploitation." "Luna, I think we've stumbled into something much bigger than a simple inheritance," Daniel said quietly. The room contained more than just artifacts. Along the back wall, Esperanza had created what amounted to a historical research center. Maps dating back to the 1800s showed the original extent of Miwok territory, including detailed annotations about sacred sites and traditional gathering places. Photographs documented the hotel's construction and early years, including several that showed Native American workers who had apparently been involved in the building process. But it was a leather-bound journal, clearly Esperanza's personal notes, that revealed the full scope of what they'd inherited. Her research had uncovered evidence that the original Whitmore family had not simply built their hotel on empty land. They had constructed it directly on top of a Miwok sacred site, using local tribal members as workers and gaining their trust before systematically looting their ceremonial treasures. "The gold discovery in 1879 wasn't a natural find," Daniel read aloud from Esperanza's notes. "Joshua Whitmore had been secretly excavating the sacred burial chambers beneath the mountain for months, using the hotel construction as cover. When Victoria discovered what her father was doing, she threatened to expose him to the authorities. Luna was examining a display case that contained not gold but personal items. A young woman's jewelry, a diary bound in faded blue leather, and a photograph that matched the one they'd found upstairs. Victoria tried to stop her father from stealing from the sacred places. She said with the certainty that came from her mysterious conversations with the hotel's ghostly resident. But he couldn't let her ruin the family fortune. The diary, when Daniel carefully opened it, confirmed Luna's supernatural insights with heartbreaking clarity. Victoria's final entries, written in September 1879, documented her growing horror at her father's crimes and her determination to make things right. "I cannot stand by while father desecrates the resting places of people who welcomed our family with kindness. The Miwok helped us build this hotel, shared their knowledge of the mountain, treated us as friends, and father has repaid their trust by stealing their most sacred treasures. I have written to the territorial authorities. I have documented everything. Tomorrow I will travel to Sacramento to deliver my testimony personally." The entry was dated September 15, 1879. According to the hotel records, Victoria had disappeared that very night. She never made it to Sacramento, Daniel realized, the pieces of a 145-year-old murder falling into place. Her father killed her to protect his secret. Luna nodded solemnly. Victoria says he told everyone she ran away to San Francisco with a traveling musician. But really, he buried her here in the mountain with the people whose treasures he stole. She's been guarding their sacred things ever since, waiting for someone from the family to come back and make it right. Daniel continued reading through Esperanza's research, discovering that his great-aunt had spent decades trying to piece together the truth about Victoria's disappearance and the source of the Whitmore fortune. Her investigations had revealed that the hotel's prosperity had been built entirely on stolen Native American gold, and that the Whitmore family had used their ill-gotten wealth to bribe officials and cover up their crimes for generations. But Esperanza had also discovered something else, legal documents proving that the land on which the hotel stood had never been legally purchased from the Miwok people. The entire Whitmore claim to the property was fraudulent, based on forged deeds and falsified surveys. "This collection doesn't belong to us," Daniel said, the moral implications becoming clear. "It belongs to the Miwok people." Esperanza was trying to find a way to return it to them. "But there's more," Luna said, pointing to a section of Esperanza's notes that Daniel had missed. "The Hartwell Corporation found out about the gold. They've been trying to buy the hotel for years, not because they want to restore it, but because they want to mine the rest of the mountain." The correspondence files revealed a pattern of increasing pressure from Hartwell Corporation, a mining company that had apparently discovered evidence of the sacred site's remaining treasures. Their offers to purchase the property had grown more aggressive over the years, culminating in barely concealed threats just weeks before Esperanza's death. As if summoned by the mention of danger, a new sound echoed through the hidden chamber, the rumble of vehicles approaching the hotel above. Through the chamber's single small window, set high in the wall at ground level, Daniel could see the headlights of multiple cars coming up the graveled drive. "Victoria says the bad people are here," Luna whispered, clutching her notebook tightly. "She says they've been watching the hotel, waiting for someone to come back so they could take everything." Daniel quickly gathered the most important documents: Esperanza's research, the Smithsonian correspondence, and Victoria's diary. Whatever was happening above, they needed to be prepared for it. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the hotel's empty halls, followed by heavy footsteps on the front veranda. Then came the sharp, authoritative knock that Daniel had been dreading since they'd first discovered the scope of their inheritance. "Mr. Garcia," a voice called through the front door, "this is Sheriff Patterson from Ravens Peak County. We need to speak with you about some concerns regarding this property." As they climbed the narrow staircase back to the ballroom, Daniel realized that their quiet family inheritance had just become a fight for justice that had been 145 years in the making. Behind them, the golden artifacts gleamed in the darkness, waiting to tell their story to a world that had forgotten the crimes committed in their name. The men at the front door weren't alone. Through the hotel's tall windows, Daniel could count at least 6 vehicles in the circular drive, ranging from Sheriff Patterson's patrol car to several black SUVs with tinted windows that screamed corporate security. Standing beside the sheriff was a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and money. Mr. Garcia, I'm going to need you and your daughter to step outside while we conduct a safety inspection, Sheriff Patterson called through the door. His voice carried the tone of someone who wasn't making a request. Daniel glanced at Luna, who was clutching her notebook and looking toward the ballroom where they left the hidden entrance unsealed. "Stay close to me, Misha," he whispered, then called back. "Just a moment, Sheriff. Let me get Luna's jacket." The suited man stepped forward impatiently. "Mr. Garcia, I'm Jonathan Hartwell, representing Hartwell Corporation. We have reason to believe this property contains environmental hazards that pose a serious risk to you and your child. Time is of the essence here." "What kind of hazards?" Daniel asked through the door, buying time while he tried to figure out how to protect the evidence they'd just discovered. "Structural instability, potential asbestos contamination, and reports of dangerous wildlife in the building," Hartwell replied smoothly. "We're prepared to offer you immediate temporary accommodation in town while we conduct a thorough assessment of the property." Luna tugged on Daniel's shirt and pointed toward the ballroom. "Victoria says they're lying," she whispered. "She says Mr. Hartwell's grandfather worked with her father to steal the gold, and now he wants to finish what they started." The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The Hartwell family hadn't just discovered the sacred site recently. They'd been part of the original conspiracy. They'd probably been watching the property for decades, waiting for the right moment to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. "Mr. Garcia," Sheriff Patterson's voice was growing more insistent, "I need to see both you and your daughter right now, for your own safety." Daniel made a quick decision. Grabbing Luna's hand, he led her quickly to the ballroom and activated the hidden mechanism. "Get down there and hide," he told her. "Take your notebook and don't come up until I call for you, no matter what you hear." "But Papa—" "Luna, listen to me. What we found down there is worth more than money. It's about justice for people who can't speak for themselves anymore. Victoria has been protecting it for 145 years, and now it's our turn." Luna nodded solemnly and disappeared down the hidden staircase. Daniel sealed the entrance and placed a decorative chair in front of the section of wall, hoping it would pass casual inspection. When he finally opened the front door, he found himself facing a small army. Sheriff Patterson was clearly uncomfortable, his body language suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. Behind him stood Jonathan Hartwell, a man in his 50s, with cold eyes and the kind of smile that never reached beyond his mouth. Several men in tactical gear flanked them, supposedly security, but with the bearing of private military contractors. "Sorry for the delay," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. "Had to make sure Luna was somewhere safe." "Where is your daughter?" Hartwell asked immediately, his gaze scanning the hotel's lobby with obvious familiarity. "Exploring upstairs. She's fascinated by old buildings." "Mr. Garcia," Sheriff Patterson said, consulting a clipboard, "we've received reports of structural damage to this building. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask both of you to vacate the premises until we can complete a full inspection." "Reports from who?" Hartwell stepped forward. "Hartwell Corporation has been monitoring this property for years as part of our environmental responsibility program. We have documentation showing significant foundation issues, possible contamination from old mining operations, and evidence of dangerous wildlife habitation." Daniel noticed that several of the men had already begun spreading out through the hotel's ground floor, their movements too purposeful for a simple safety inspection. They knew the layout, knew what they were looking for. "I appreciate your concern," Daniel said carefully, "but I haven't seen any evidence of structural problems. The building seems remarkably solid for its age." Nevertheless, Hartwell's voice carried a threat barely disguised as courtesy. "Liability issues require us to take immediate action. The county has the authority to condemn unsafe structures, and Sheriff Patterson has the paperwork ready." One of the tactical team members emerged from the dining room and shook his head slightly at Hartwell. They were searching for something specific, and they hadn't found it yet. "There's also the matter of proper permits," Sheriff Patterson added reluctantly. "Apparently, there are questions about whether this property transfer was handled correctly. Something about missing documentation and disputed ownership claims." Daniel felt his anger rising. The inheritance was handled by a licensed attorney. Everything is completely legal. "Legal matters can be complicated," Hartwell said with false sympathy, "especially when they involve properties with such complex histories. Did you know, for instance, that there are outstanding mineral rights claims on this land? claims that predate your great-aunt's ownership? The threat was becoming clearer. They weren't just trying to force him out temporarily. They were laying groundwork to challenge his legal right to the property entirely. "Mr. Garcia," another voice called from the hotel's entrance. A woman in her 30s with the bearing of a federal agent was walking up the front steps, her badge clearly visible. "I'm Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI's art crime team. We need to speak with you about some items that may have been discovered on this property." Hartwell's composure slipped for just a moment, his eyes flashing with irritation at this unexpected development. "Agent Martinez, I wasn't aware the Bureau was involved in this matter." "Cultural artifact theft is a federal crime, Mr. Hartwell," she replied coolly. "Especially when it involves Native American sacred objects. We've been investigating reports of illegal excavation and artifact trafficking in this area for quite some time." Daniel felt a surge of hope. Somehow, word about Esperanza's collection had reached the right people. But his relief was short-lived when he realized that Luna was still hidden below with evidence that could make her a target. "Luna," he called toward the staircase, hoping she could hear him. "Could you come down here, please? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Silence. "Mr. Garcia," Agent Martinez said gently, "where is your daughter?" Before Daniel could answer, one of Hartwell's men appeared at the top of the main staircase. "Sir, we've completed the upper floor sweep. No sign of the child." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Daniel noticed that the hotel's lights had begun flickering in a pattern he was starting to recognize. Somewhere in the walls, the old building's pipes began to rattle, and the chandelier overhead swayed slightly despite the absence of any wind. "Luna," Daniel called again, more urgently this time. That's when they heard it. Piano music drifting from the ballroom, but not Victoria's gentle classical pieces. This was different, urgent, almost martial in its rhythm. And underneath the music, clear as a bell, came Luna's voice singing along to a melody that had been composed 145 years ago. "The ballroom," Agent Martinez said, recognizing the direction of the sound. But as they all moved toward the music, Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. Hartwell wasn't surprised by the piano music. His expression was knowing, almost satisfied, as if this was exactly what he'd been waiting for. "Fascinating acoustics in these old buildings," Hartwell murmured. "Sound carries in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes it even seems like the dead are trying to tell us something." The music grew louder as they approached the ballroom, and Daniel realized that whatever protection Victoria had been providing was about to be tested in ways that neither she nor Luna might be prepared for. Behind them, more vehicles were arriving in the hotel's circular drive, and Daniel caught a glimpse of men with specialized equipment that had nothing to do with building inspections or safety concerns. The hunt for the Whitmore treasure had officially begun, and his 9-year-old daughter was sitting directly on top of the prize. The ballroom was empty when they arrived, but the piano was still playing itself with an intensity that made the air vibrate. The melody had shifted into something that sounded like a warning, notes cascading in urgent patterns that seemed to echo off the walls with supernatural resonance. Agent Martinez pulled out her phone and began recording, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to genuine amazement. "Mr. Garcia," she said quietly, "I need you to understand that what we're dealing with here goes far beyond a simple property dispute. 3 weeks ago, our art crime team received an anonymous package containing photographs and documentation of what appears to be the largest collection of stolen Native American artifacts in California history." Daniel felt his heart skip. "Anonymous package?" "Postmarked from Ravens Peak, mailed the day before your great-aunt's death. Someone wanted to make sure this information reached the right people, even if they couldn't deliver it personally." Hartwell had moved closer to the piano, his eyes scanning the ballroom with the systematic attention of someone conducting a search. "Agent Martinez, I think you'll find that any historical artifacts on this property are well within the legal parameters of private collection. The Whitmore family has documented provenance for their holdings." "Forged provenance," Agent Martinez corrected sharply. "We've had experts examine the documentation your family provided to various auction houses over the years. The paperwork was sophisticated, but ultimately fraudulent." The piano music stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt pregnant with tension. In that quiet, Daniel heard something that made his stomach clench with fear. Luna's voice, muffled but audible, calling his name from somewhere below their feet. Hartwell heard it too, his head tilting like a predator catching the scent of prey. Interesting. Your daughter seems to have found her way into the hotel's basement areas. I hope she's being careful down there. Old buildings can be dangerous, especially in spaces that weren't designed for children. Luna, Daniel called loudly, hoping she would hear him and stay hidden. Everything's fine up here. Keep exploring, Misha. But Agent Martinez was studying the ballroom more carefully now, her trained eye catching details that others might miss. She approached the section of wall where the hidden entrance was concealed, running her fingers along the paneling with professional thoroughness. Mr. Garcia, your great-aunt's package included architectural plans for this building, plans that show spaces that aren't visible in the current layout. She pressed against a section of baseboard, and Daniel's heart sank as the hidden panel clicked open, including what appears to be a substantial underground chamber. Hartwell's false courtesy evaporated entirely. Agent Martinez, I must insist that any exploration of this property be conducted with proper safety precautions and legal oversight. Hartwell Corporation has legitimate interests here that predate the current ownership. What kind of legitimate interests? Daniel demanded, his protective instincts overriding his caution. For the first time, Hartwell smiled genuinely, and it was not a pleasant expression. The kind that comes from family history, Mr. Garcia. You see, my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Hartwell, was Joshua Whitmore's business partner in the original development of this property. When Whitmore's daughter unfortunately disappeared, Thomas helped the family manage certain complications that arose from her absence. The implication was clear, and Daniel felt sick. The Hartwell family hadn't just been complicit in covering up Victoria's murder. They'd been active participants in the conspiracy from the beginning. Agent Martinez was already calling for backup on her radio. I need the cultural preservation team here immediately, along with forensic specialists. We have a potential crime scene that's been undisturbed for over a century. Papa! Luna's voice echoed up from the hidden staircase, followed by the sound of her footsteps as she climbed toward them. Victoria says the bad people brought machines to steal the sacred things. She emerged from the opening with her notebook clutched tightly, her face flushed with excitement and fear. But it was what she was carrying in her other hand that made everyone in the room freeze. A golden ceremonial mask that gleamed with the unmistakable luster of pure Miwok craftsmanship. Luna, no, Daniel breathed, realizing that she'd just revealed the existence of the treasure to the very people who wanted to steal it. Hartwell's eyes locked onto the mask with undisguised hunger. That's a remarkable reproduction, little girl. Where did you find it? It's not a reproduction, Luna said with 9-year-old directness. It's real, and it belongs to the Miwok people. Victoria told me so. Agent Martinez approached Luna carefully, as if the child were holding a live explosive. Luna, sweetheart, can you tell me what else you saw down there? There's a whole room full of beautiful things, gold jewelry and ceremonies, cups and masks like this one. Tia Esperanza was taking care of them for the people they belong to. Luna looked directly at Hartwell with startling intensity. But your family helped steal them a long time ago, and now you want to steal them again. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Sheriff Patterson, who had been increasingly uncomfortable throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. Mr. Hartwell, maybe it's time you explained exactly what your company's interest in this property really is. Before Hartwell could answer, Luna opened her notebook and showed them a drawing that made Daniel's blood run cold. It depicted the hotel's grounds surrounded by massive excavation equipment, bulldozers, industrial mining gear, and what appeared to be a complete strip mining operation. Victoria showed me what they want to do, Luna said solemnly. They don't just want the things that are already here. They want to dig up the whole mountain to find more gold. But the mountain is sacred. It's where the Miwok people buried their ancestors and kept their most important ceremonies. Agent Martinez was photographing Luna's drawing while simultaneously coordinating with her team over the radio. This constitutes intent to destroy a protected cultural site. Mr. Hartwell, I'm going to need you and your men to step away from this property immediately. I'm afraid that's not possible, Hartwell replied, his mask of civility finally dropping completely. Hartwell Corporation has invested too much time and resources in this project to walk away now. As if summoned by his words, the sound of heavy machinery echoed from outside the hotel. Through the ballroom's tall windows, Daniel could see industrial vehicles positioning themselves around the property perimeter. Not the building inspection equipment Hartwell had claimed to be bringing, but serious excavation gear. They were planning this all along, Daniel realized. The safety inspection, the legal challenges, all of it was just a cover to get access to the property. Luna was listening to something only she could hear, her head tilted in concentration. Victoria says they've been planning this since Tia Esperanza got sick. They knew she was going to die soon, and they were waiting for someone new to take over the hotel so they could steal everything. The piano began playing again, but this time it was joined by other sounds, voices singing in a language that predated English in California by thousands of years. The temperature in the ballroom dropped noticeably, and Agent Martinez looked around in amazement as translucent figures began materializing throughout the space. "My God," she whispered, "what is this?" Luna smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "It's the Miwok people whose treasures are hidden down there. Victoria called them to help protect their sacred things." The ghostly figures were becoming more solid by the moment, their traditional clothing and ceremonial regalia clearly visible. They filled the ballroom with dignified presence, standing between the hidden entrance and the men who wanted to exploit what their people had considered sacred. Hartwell stumbled backward, his corporate confidence cracking in the face of the supernatural intervention. "This is impossible. Dead people can't." "Can't what?" Luna asked innocently. "Can't care about justice? Can't protect the things they loved? Can't help good people fight bad people?" The lead figure among the spirits stepped forward and spoke in accented English that carried the weight of generations. "This mountain is the resting place of our ancestors. These treasures are the sacred objects of our people. They were stolen through murder and betrayal, and we will not allow them to be stolen again." Outside, the sound of more vehicles arriving suggested that the confrontation was far from over. But for the first time since inheriting the hotel, Daniel felt like they might have allies powerful enough to match the forces arrayed against them. The battle for the Whitmore treasure had become something larger, a fight for justice that had been 145 years in the making, with the dead and the living finally united in common cause. The spirits' intervention had an immediate effect on the hotel's atmosphere, but it was what Agent Martinez discovered in the hidden chamber that changed everything. As she descended the narrow staircase with proper lighting equipment, her radio crackled with increasingly excited communications to her FBI team. "Command, this is Martinez. I need immediate contact with the National Museum of the American Indian and the California Historical Preservation Office. What I'm seeing down here isn't just a collection. It's the most significant intact ceremonial treasure cache in North American archaeological history." Daniel followed her down, leaving Luna safely upstairs with 2 FBI agents who had arrived as backup. The chamber looked even more impressive under professional lighting. Agent Martinez moved from case to case with the careful precision of someone who understood she was documenting evidence that would rewrite history books. "These aren't just valuable artifacts," she explained, photographing each piece methodically. "Some of these ceremonial objects were described in Spanish colonial records from the 1600s and presumed lost forever. This golden eagle ceremonial headdress alone." She paused, checking her reference materials. The last time anything like this appeared publicly was in 1847, when the California mission records mentioned it being worn by Chief Tenaya of the Awanichi people. But it was the documentation that Esperanza had compiled that truly revealed the scope of what they'd inherited. Her research had gone far beyond simply cataloging the stolen artifacts. She'd traced the genealogical lines of the original Miwok families, documented the sacred significance of each piece, and most importantly, established legal frameworks for returning the collection to its rightful cultural inheritors. "Your great-aunt wasn't just preserving these artifacts," Agent Martinez said, studying Esperanza's meticulously organized files. "She was building a legal case for cultural repatriation that would have been ironclad in federal court." Daniel examined a thick folder labeled Hartwell Family Correspondence, Evidence of Ongoing Conspiracy. Inside were photocopies of letters dating back to the 1950s, revealing that the Hartwell family had been pressuring successive owners of the hotel for decades, always with the same goal: gaining access to what they knew was hidden beneath the building. "Look at this," Daniel said, holding up a letter from 1967. "Thomas Hartwell, Jr., that must be Jonathan's grandfather, offering to buy the hotel from the previous owners for 10 times its assessed value. And when they refused, suddenly there were tax assessments, building code violations, and mysterious accidents that forced them to sell. Agent Martinez read over his shoulder, her expression growing darker. This establishes a pattern of criminal conspiracy spanning multiple generations. The Hartwell family has been systematically acquiring properties around this area for over 70 years, always using the same methods: intimidation, legal manipulation, and when necessary, direct action. A map on Esperanza's wall showed the true scope of the Hartwell operation. Red pins marked dozens of properties throughout the region where the family had successfully forced out owners and begun mining operations. Blue pins indicated sites where they'd been unsuccessful, mostly due to legal challenges or community resistance. The Whitmore Grand Hotel was the largest blue pin on the map, surrounded by a ring of red ones. They've been systematically strip mining sacred Miwok sites for decades, Daniel realized. This hotel isn't just about the treasure in this room. It's about completing their destruction of an entire people's spiritual homeland. But Esperanza's most important discovery was contained in a sealed envelope marked, quote, "For Garcia family eyes only, open only in case of immediate threat." Inside, Daniel found documents that made his hands shake. Authenticated copies of the original 1870s correspondence between Joshua Whitmore and Thomas Hartwell Sr., detailing their plan to eliminate Victoria and cover up the systematic looting of Miwok burial sites. The letters were written in the casual, businesslike tone of men discussing a routine commercial transaction. They discussed Victoria's problem and the need for a permanent solution, with the same detachment they used to debate mining equipment purchases and labor costs. "These are confession letters," Agent Martinez said grimly, "written evidence of premeditated murder and cultural genocide. With modern forensic analysis, we can probably even authenticate the ink and paper to establish their age and authenticity." But the most chilling discovery was the final letter in the sequence, dated just days before Victoria's disappearance. Thomas Hartwell Sr. had written, "The girl's conscience will be the ruin of us all. She's already contacted that meddlesome territorial administrator about our arrangements with the local tribes. Joshua, you know what must be done. Make it look like she ran off with that traveling musician who's been performing at the hotel. I'll handle the disposal." They planned every detail, Daniel said, feeling sick. Victoria never had a chance. Agent Martinez was already on her radio, calling for additional forensic teams. "We need ground-penetrating radar and a full archaeological survey team. If Victoria Whitmore is buried somewhere on this property, we're going to find her." That's when they heard Luna's voice calling urgently from upstairs, followed by the sound of heavy machinery growing much closer to the hotel. Daniel and Agent Martinez climbed quickly back to the ballroom, where they found Luna at the window with one of the FBI agents, both of them looking out at a scene that made Daniel's stomach drop. Jonathan Hartwell had apparently decided that subtle approach was no longer necessary. The property was now surrounded by a small army of private security contractors, and massive excavation equipment was being unloaded from industrial trailers. Bulldozers, earth movers, and what appeared to be serious mining gear were taking positions around the hotel's perimeter. "Papa, they're not waiting anymore," Luna said, her voice tight with fear. "Victoria says they're going to start digging whether we agree or not." Agent Martinez was coordinating frantically with her headquarters, but her expression suggested she wasn't getting the immediate response she needed. "My team is 90 minutes out, and we don't have enough people here to stop an operation this size." Through the window, they could see Hartwell directing his contractors with the efficiency of someone who'd planned this operation down to the smallest detail. He'd clearly been preparing for the moment when legal niceties would no longer serve his purposes. "Mr. Garcia," Sheriff Patterson's voice called from outside, amplified by a bullhorn, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to evacuate the building immediately. Hartwell Corporation has obtained an emergency court order citing imminent public safety hazards." "That's impossible," Agent Martinez snapped. "No judge would sign an emergency evacuation order based on—" She was interrupted by Luna's gasp of recognition. "Papa, look at the papers Sheriff Patterson is holding. They have the same seal as the old letters from the bad judge." Daniel looked more carefully and realized Luna was right. The official seal on the court documents was identical to the one they'd seen on the 1870s correspondence, suggesting that the Hartwell family's influence over local legal systems stretched back generations and apparently continued to the present day. Judge Hamilton, Agent Martinez said grimly, reading the signature on the court order through binoculars, "I should have known. The FBI has been investigating his financial connections for months." But their legal problems were becoming academic as the sound of diesel engines filled the air. The excavation equipment was moving into position, and Daniel could see survey crews setting up markers around the hotel grounds. "They're not planning to wait for us to leave," he realized. "They're going to start digging whether we're here or not." Luna was listening to something only she could hear, her face growing pale with concentration. "Victoria says there's something else hidden in the hotel, something that proves the Hartwell family killed more people than just her. She says Tia Esperanza found evidence but hid it somewhere even more secret than the treasure room." "Where?" Daniel asked urgently. "In the place where Victoria died. Where the Hartwell men thought no one would ever look because it's too scary for living people to go." Agent Martinez looked at Luna with growing understanding. "The third floor. The area that was damaged in the fire." The rumble of approaching bulldozers was getting louder, and through the ballroom windows Daniel could see Hartwell's contractors preparing to begin excavation whether the building's occupants consented or not. They had minutes, maybe less, before the situation moved beyond legal technicalities into direct physical confrontation. But somewhere in the fire-damaged upper reaches of the hotel, evidence waited that could expose a conspiracy of murder and theft spanning 3 centuries. The question was whether they could find it before the bulldozers started, and whether they would survive the discovery. The ghostly figure of Victoria Whitmore materialized beside Luna, more solid than Daniel had ever seen her, her 19-year-old face set with the determination of someone who had waited 145 years for justice. "Follow me," she said in a voice that carried both sorrow and hope. "It's time to finish what I started." The third floor of the Whitmore Grand Hotel was a maze of fire-damaged rooms and collapsed ceilings that hadn't seen human visitors in decades. Victoria's ghostly form led them through hallways where charred beams hung at dangerous angles, and the floorboards creaked ominously with each step. Agent Martinez followed with her equipment, documenting everything while maintaining radio contact with her backup teams who were still 40 minutes away. "This fire wasn't random," Victoria explained as they navigated through what had once been the hotel's most luxurious guest suites. "After Father murdered me, he realized that my room contained evidence of my investigation. He waited 3 months, then staged an electrical fire to destroy anything I might have left behind." Luna walked confidently beside the ghost, her notebook out as she sketched the damaged areas. But Victoria was too smart for her father. She hid the really important things where fire couldn't reach them. They stopped at what appeared to be a dead end, a section of hallway where the ceiling had collapsed completely, blocking access to the rest of the floor. But Victoria pointed to a section of damaged wall, where the fire had actually revealed something hidden, the outline of a door that had been walled over and painted to match the surrounding surfaces. "My private study," Victoria said softly. "Father had it sealed after my death, told everyone it was too damaged by grief to preserve. But he really wanted to make sure no one would ever find what I'd hidden inside." Agent Martinez examined the concealed entrance with professional interest. "The fire damage actually helped us here. Without the heat warping the wall, we might never have noticed the outline. It took considerable effort to break through the old plaster and wooden planks that had sealed the door for 145 years. But when they finally opened Victoria's private study, Daniel felt like they'd stepped into a time capsule that had been perfectly preserved by accident. The room was small but had clearly been designed as a young woman's intellectual sanctuary. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on law, Native American culture, and social justice that were remarkably progressive for the 1870s. A desk by the window still held Victoria's personal correspondence, and the walls were covered with maps and photographs documenting her investigation into her father's crimes. But it was the contents of a hidden safe behind a portrait of Chief Tenaya that truly revealed the scope of what Victoria had discovered. Agent Martinez worked carefully to document each item as they removed it. Detailed photographs of Miwok's ceremonial sites before and after they'd been looted, financial records showing the Hartwell family's payments to corrupt officials, and most damning of all, a collection of death certificates for Native Americans who had died under suspicious circumstances while working for the Whitmore-Hartwell partnership. She didn't just document the theft of artifacts, Agent Martinez said, studying Victoria's careful notes. She uncovered evidence of systematic murder. Look at these records. The documents painted a horrifying picture. Miwok workers who had helped with the hotel's construction were systematically eliminated once they'd revealed the locations of sacred sites. The deaths were always made to look accidental: cave-ins, equipment failures, sudden illnesses. But Victoria's investigation had revealed the pattern. 47 people, Daniel read from Victoria's summary notes, 47 human beings murdered to cover up the theft of their people's sacred treasures. Luna was examining a collection of photographs that showed the mountain as it had existed before the mining operations began. Victoria says these pictures prove that the whole area was sacred to the Miwok people. Not just the ceremonial sites, but the entire mountain was considered a living spiritual being. But the most significant discovery was a leather portfolio labeled "Legal Evidence for Federal Prosecution." Inside, Victoria had assembled what amounted to a complete case file that would have destroyed both the Whitmore and Hartwell families if it had ever reached the proper authorities. She was building a federal case, Agent Martinez realized. These documents show systematic violation of territorial laws regarding Native American rights, multiple counts of murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and what we would now classify as cultural genocide. The portfolio included signed statements from surviving Miwok witnesses, detailed maps showing the original sacred site boundaries, and most importantly, a confession letter that Victoria had somehow obtained from Thomas Hartwell Sr. himself. How did she get this? Daniel asked, examining the letter that detailed the entire conspiracy from Hartwell's perspective. She seduced him, Luna said matter-of-factly, translating what Victoria was telling her. She pretended to be interested in him romantically, and he bragged about everything they'd done because he wanted to impress her with how clever and ruthless he was. The confession letter was devastating in its casual detail. Hartwell had described the murders as necessary business expenses, and the cultural destruction as, quote, clearing away primitive obstacles to progress. He'd even included financial projections, showing how much money they expected to make from selling the stolen artifacts to private collectors in San Francisco and New York. But their examination of Victoria's evidence was interrupted by an urgent call from Agent Martinez's radio. "Martinez, this is command. We've got a problem. Judge Hamilton has issued a second court order authorizing immediate emergency excavation to protect public safety. Hartwell's contractors are claiming there's an imminent risk of building collapse that requires immediate stabilization through controlled demolition." Through the third-floor windows, they could see that the excavation equipment had moved much closer to the hotel. Bulldozers were positioned around the building's foundation, and crews were setting up what appeared to be explosive charges for controlled demolition. They're not planning to excavate carefully, Daniel realized with growing horror. They're going to blow up the entire hotel to get to what's underneath. Agent Martinez was coordinating frantically with her headquarters, but the response was not encouraging. Federal jurisdiction is being challenged by local authorities. We need either a direct presidential order or a ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to override the local court orders. How long would that take? Daniel asked. Hours. Maybe days. We don't have hours, Luna said urgently. Victoria says they're going to start the demolition in 30 minutes, whether we're still inside or not. The sound of approaching helicopters suggested that the situation was escalating beyond anything they could handle with the resources currently available. Through the windows, Daniel could see news crews setting up in the distance, apparently alerted to what was about to become a very public confrontation. But Victoria had led them to her hidden study for a reason that went beyond simply revealing historical evidence. She moved to a section of the room that had seemed empty, pressing her ghostly hand against a specific floorboard that immediately clicked and rose slightly. Underneath was a final hiding place that Victoria had prepared specifically for this moment, a waterproof container holding documents that made everything they'd found previously seem preliminary. The real evidence, Victoria said as Luna carefully lifted out the container. The proof that the Hartwell family's crimes didn't end in 1879. They've been continuing the same pattern for 145 years, moving from site to site across California, always using the same methods: always targeting Native American communities who can't fight back effectively. Agent Martinez opened the container with trembling hands. Inside were documents that connected the historical Hartwell crimes to a modern network of illegal mining operations, cultural artifact trafficking, and systematic destruction of protected Native American sites across the western United States. This isn't just about one hotel or one treasure cache, she realized. This is evidence of the largest ongoing cultural genocide operation in American history. The sound of the approaching demolition crew was getting louder, and Daniel could see Hartwell himself directing the placement of explosive charges around the hotel's foundation. They had minutes to get this evidence to safety before the entire building became a pile of rubble. But as they prepared to evacuate Victoria's study, Luna looked up from the documents with an expression of grim determination that reminded Daniel powerfully of her mother. "Victoria says there's one more thing we need to do before we leave," she announced. "Something that will make sure the truth comes out, even if the bad people destroy everything else." The ghostly figure of Victoria Whitmore smiled for the first time since they'd met her, and Daniel realized that 145 years of planning were about to culminate in a way that Jonathan Hartwell had never anticipated. The battle for justice was entering its final phase, and the dead were about to have their say in a very public forum. Victoria's final revelation came as the sound of demolition equipment grew closer to the hotel. She led them to a section of her study where the fire damage had actually exposed something extraordinary, a complete photographic darkroom that had been hidden behind a false wall. The chemicals had long since dried up, but hanging from lines stretched across the small space were dozens of photographs that the fire's heat had actually helped preserve by creating a sealed, dry environment. "I documented everything," Victoria explained as Luna carefully examined the photographs. "Every meeting between Father and the Hartwell men, every delivery of stolen artifacts, every payment to corrupt officials. I knew that someday someone would need proof of what really happened." Agent Martinez was stunned by what she was seeing. The photographs showed Joshua Whitmore and Thomas Hartwell Sr. in the act of cataloging stolen Miwok artifacts, surrounded by wooden crates marked with shipping addresses to wealthy collectors in San Francisco, New York, and even European museums. But more damaging were the photographs that showed the systematic murder of Miwok witnesses. "These images document war crimes," Agent Martinez said, her voice tight with anger. "Systematic extermination of indigenous people for commercial gain." But it was the final set of photographs that changed everything. Victoria had somehow managed to document a meeting that took place just days before her own murder. A gathering that included not just her father and Thomas Hartwell Sr., but also Judge Hamilton's predecessor, Sheriff Patterson's grandfather, and a representative from what appeared to be a federal territorial office. The conspiracy went all the way to the territorial government, Daniel realized. This wasn't just local corruption, this was a federally sanctioned genocide. Luna was studying one photograph in particular, her face pale with understanding. "Victoria says this picture proves that the same families have been working together for 145 years. Look at the man in the government uniform." Agent Martinez examined the photograph more closely, and her expression shifted to one of recognition and growing outrage. "That's Secretary of Indian Affairs William Morrison, the territorial official responsible for protecting Native American rights." "Morrison," Daniel repeated, "like Robert Morrison, the lawyer who handled Esperanza's estate." "His great-great-grandfather," Luna confirmed, translating Victoria's explanation. "The Morrison family has been protecting the conspiracy for 5 generations, making sure the legal system always works in favor of the Hartwell operations." The implications were staggering. The network of corruption that had enabled the systematic destruction of Miwok culture wasn't just a historical artifact. It was a living conspiracy that had been passed down through generations of powerful families, each one adding their own layer of protection and expansion. But their discovery was interrupted by a new sound that made everyone freeze, the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery. Through the windows, they could see that Hartwell's demolition equipment included military-grade explosive devices that were clearly designed to level the entire hotel in a matter of minutes. "They're not planning a controlled demolition," Agent Martinez realized. "They're planning to destroy all evidence that this place ever existed." That's when the supernatural intervention began in earnest. The temperature in Victoria's study dropped 30 degrees in as many seconds, and the air began to shimmer with an energy that made the hair on Daniel's arms stand up. Victoria's ghostly form became more solid than ever, and she was no longer alone. Translucent figures began materializing throughout the room, dozens of them, then hundreds. Miwok men, women, and children in traditional dress, their faces bearing the dignity of people who had endured injustice but never surrendered their spiritual strength. Among them were figures in more recent clothing, people who had died over the past century while fighting to protect their ancestral lands from Hartwell's expanding operations. 145 years of victims, Victoria said, her voice now carrying the combined strength of all the spirits present. Everyone who died to protect these sacred places, everyone who was murdered to cover up the truth, everyone who gave their lives fighting this evil, we're all here. Luna was sketching frantically, her pencil moving across the page with supernatural speed as she captured images that no camera could record. "They're not just here to testify," she announced. "They're here to take action." Agent Martinez was recording everything on her phone while simultaneously coordinating with her backup teams. "Command, I need immediate federal intervention. We have documented evidence of ongoing genocide and a private army preparing to destroy a protected cultural site." But the response from her headquarters was not encouraging. Martinez were being blocked at every level. Federal judges are refusing to hear emergency motions, and the Pentagon is claiming this is outside their jurisdiction. Because the conspiracy includes people at the federal level, Daniel realized, the same families that started this in 1879 now have representatives in Washington, D.C. Outside, the demolition countdown had clearly begun. Through the windows, they could see Hartwell's contractors evacuating to a safe distance, while explosive charges were being armed around the hotel's foundation. But something was happening that none of Hartwell's people had anticipated. The excavation equipment was malfunctioning. Bulldozers that had been running perfectly moments before were now smoking and sparking as their electrical systems failed simultaneously. The explosive charges were going dead as their detonation devices mysteriously lost power. Even the vehicles that Hartwell's contractors were using for evacuation were beginning to break down in ways that defied mechanical explanation. "Electromagnetic interference," Agent Martinez observed, checking her equipment. "But the pattern is too organized to be natural." Victoria smiled as the army of spirits around her began to move through the walls of the hotel, heading toward the equipment that threatened their sacred mountain. The dead have certain advantages over the living when it comes to manipulating electrical systems. Luna looked up from her drawing, which now showed the hotel surrounded by hundreds of translucent figures, all of them focusing their spiritual energy on protecting the building and its contents. Victoria says they've been planning this moment for decades. Every person who died fighting the Hartwell family has been waiting for the chance to finish what they started. The effect on Hartwell's operation was immediate and devastating. Every piece of electronic equipment on the property began failing simultaneously. Communication systems went dead, vehicle engines seized, and even simple battery-powered devices stopped functioning as spiritual energy overloaded their circuits. But the supernatural intervention went beyond simple equipment failure. News crews that had gathered to document the demolition were suddenly getting clear footage of the ghostly army that surrounded the hotel. Camera operators found their equipment working perfectly to record the spiritual manifestations, while Hartwell's contractors discovered that their attempts to document their own operations were being blocked by unexplained technical failures. The spirits are controlling what gets recorded, Agent Martinez realized, watching her own equipment respond selectively to different subjects. They're making sure the world sees the truth while preventing the conspirators from creating their own version of events. Through the hotel's windows, they could see Jonathan Hartwell himself moving frantically from one failed piece of equipment to another, his corporate composure cracking as his carefully planned operation fell apart around him. His contractors were backing away from machinery that sparked and smoked, despite having been functioning perfectly moments before. But the most remarkable development was the arrival of new allies. Cars and trucks were streaming up the mountain road toward the hotel. Vehicles carrying representatives from the Miwok Cultural Preservation Society, the California Native American Heritage Commission, and what appeared to be legal representatives from multiple tribal nations. "How did they know to come here?" Daniel asked. Luna consulted her notebook, where she'd been recording messages from the spirits. Victoria says the ancestors called to their living descendants. When the spirits became active, their people felt it and came to help. Agent Martinez was coordinating with the arriving tribal representatives, her radio traffic now including voices of people who understood the cultural significance of what they were protecting. Federal jurisdiction questions were becoming irrelevant as Native American sovereignty rights took precedence over local court orders. "Mr. Hartwell," a voice called through a bullhorn from the arriving tribal delegation, "you are trespassing on sacred land that is protected under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Remove your equipment immediately or face federal prosecution." But Hartwell wasn't finished yet. As his electronic equipment failed and his legal cover crumbled, he was making one final desperate gambit that would test whether the alliance between the living and the dead was strong enough to overcome a century and a half of systematic oppression. The real confrontation was just beginning, and its outcome would determine whether justice delayed could finally become justice served. Hartwell's final gambit revealed itself when the failed electronic equipment was suddenly replaced by something far more dangerous: men with weapons who clearly weren't concerned about legal niceties or supernatural interference. As his corporate facade crumbled completely, Hartwell was exposing the violent core that had always lurked beneath his family's operations. "Mr. Garcia," Hartwell's voice boomed through a manual bullhorn as armed contractors took positions around the hotel. "You have 60 seconds to evacuate the building with your daughter before we begin forced extraction procedures." Agent Martinez was on her radio, calling for immediate federal intervention, but her face showed the strain of someone fighting a battle on multiple fronts. "Command, we have armed mercenaries threatening federal agents and protected witnesses. I need tactical support immediately." "Negative, Martinez. All federal response teams are being redirected to a national security incident in Sacramento. You're on your own for at least 3 hours." Daniel felt his world tilt as he realized they were facing a carefully orchestrated scenario where help would be delayed just long enough for Hartwell to accomplish his goals. They planned this. The federal response is being blocked deliberately. But Luna was listening to Victoria with growing excitement rather than fear. "Papa, Victoria says the spirits have been waiting 145 years for this exact moment. When the Hartwell family finally drops all pretense and shows their true nature to the world." The army of ghostly figures that filled the hotel was growing more substantial by the minute, their translucent forms taking on increasing solidity as their combined spiritual energy focused on the immediate threat. Victoria herself was now so solid that she cast clear shadows, and her voice carried with the authority of someone who had transcended death to seek justice. "Jonathan Hartwell," Victoria called out, her voice somehow carrying clearly through the hotel's walls to reach the armed men outside. "Your family has spent 145 years hiding behind lawyers and corrupt officials. Are you finally ready to face your victims directly?" The response was immediate and telling. Several of Hartwell's contractors stumbled backward as Victoria's voice reached them, their weapons dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers. Others were backing away from positions they'd just taken, their faces pale with terror as they realized they were confronting something beyond their training or experience. But Hartwell himself seemed to have expected this supernatural resistance. "My great-great-grandfather warned the family that the Whitmore property was problematic," he called back. "That's why we brought specialized equipment." Agent Martinez looked out the window and cursed under her breath. Mixed in with the conventional security contractors were men carrying devices that she didn't recognize: electromagnetic field generators, industrial-strength speakers, and what appeared to be some kind of energy projection equipment. Spiritual warfare technology, she realized grimly. They've developed weapons specifically designed to disrupt paranormal manifestations. The first test of these devices came moments later. Hartwell's technicians activated what looked like a massive Tesla coil, sending crackling electrical fields throughout the area around the hotel. The effect on the ghostly army was immediate and disturbing. Many of the spirits flickered and began to fade, their forms disrupted by the artificial electromagnetic interference. "They're hurting the ancestors," Luna said, her voice tight with anger as she watched the spiritual figures struggle against the technological assault. "Victoria says her people are in pain." But the spirits weren't helpless victims. As the electromagnetic weapons disrupted their manifestations, they began to adapt their tactics. Instead of maintaining individual forms, they merged their consciousness into collective entities that were too powerful for the technology to disperse entirely. We have faced extinction before. Victoria's voice now carried the combined strength of hundreds of souls, and we have survived. Your machines cannot destroy what was never merely physical. The merged spiritual consciousness began affecting the mountain itself. Trees around the hotel started swaying despite the absence of wind. Rocks began shifting in patterns that suggested geological instability, and the very ground beneath Hartwell's equipment started to tremble with increasing intensity. They're triggering an earthquake, Agent Martinez realized, watching her seismic monitoring equipment register growing disturbances centered directly beneath the hotel. But this wasn't random destruction. The spiritual energy was targeting specific locations with surgical precision, destabilizing the ground beneath Hartwell's equipment while leaving the hotel's foundation completely stable. Expensive machinery began sinking into suddenly soft earth, while the contractors found themselves struggling to maintain their footing on terrain that shifted unpredictably beneath their feet. Daniel watched in amazement as nature itself seemed to be rising in defense of the sacred site. They're not just ghosts anymore. They're guardian spirits of the entire mountain. Luna was sketching rapidly, her drawings now showing the merged spiritual consciousness as a massive, translucent figure that encompassed the entire mountainside, with individual ancestors visible as points of light within its form. Victoria says this is what her people always knew, that the mountain is alive, and it remembers everyone who has loved it and everyone who has tried to harm it. The technological warfare escalated as Hartwell's technicians deployed more sophisticated equipment. Sonic weapons designed to disrupt spiritual manifestations filled the air with frequencies that made the living humans cover their ears in pain. But the combined consciousness of the ancestors absorbed the sonic assault and transformed it into something else entirely, a harmonic resonance that began affecting the molecular structure of Hartwell's equipment. Metal components started vibrating apart at their joints. Electronic circuits overloaded as the spiritual energy found ways to channel itself through the very devices designed to combat it. Even the weapons that Hartwell's contractors carried began malfunctioning as their metal components resonated in harmony with frequencies that existed beyond the physical spectrum. "This is impossible," Hartwell screamed over the growing harmonic chaos. "Dead people can't fight back against modern technology." "They're not just dead people," Luna called back, her young voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "They're the guardians of this sacred place, and you've been stealing from them for 145 years. They're done being patient." The arrival of additional tribal representatives marked a turning point in the confrontation. Cars and trucks continued streaming up the mountain road, carrying not just legal observers, but also spiritual leaders from multiple Native American nations who understood the significance of what was happening. An elderly Miwok medicine woman emerged from one of the vehicles, her presence immediately recognized by the ancestral spirits. As she began chanting in the traditional language, the ghostly army's power amplified dramatically, their combined consciousness solidifying into a force that Hartwell's technology could no longer disrupt effectively. "The ancestors welcome their living family," Victoria announced, her individual voice now distinguishable within the larger spiritual chorus. "The circle is complete. The sacred mountain has its full protection again." Agent Martinez was documenting everything while coordinating with the arriving tribal authorities, but her expression showed someone witnessing events that would challenge the scientific understanding of reality itself. "Command, I'm observing direct interaction between documented spiritual manifestations and advanced electromagnetic technology. The paranormal entities are not only resisting technological countermeasures but are actively neutralizing them through unknown mechanisms." But Hartwell wasn't finished. As his high-tech approach failed, he was reverting to the crude violence that had always been his family's ultimate solution to problems they couldn't solve through corruption or intimidation. "If we can't extract the treasure cleanly," he shouted to his remaining contractors, "then we'll take it by force and sort out the legal consequences later." The final confrontation was about to begin, pitting 145 years of accumulated injustice against an alliance between the living and the dead that was determined to see justice finally served. The mountain itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see whether love and spiritual strength could finally overcome greed and violence in their purest forms. The violence began when Hartwell's remaining contractors attempted to storm the hotel directly, abandoning their failed technological approach for simple brute force. But they discovered immediately that the spiritual guardians of the mountain weren't limited to electromagnetic manipulation. They could interact with the physical world in ways that defied every expectation. The first contractor to reach the hotel's front steps found himself face to face with Chief Tenaya himself, the legendary Miwok leader materializing in full ceremonial regalia, with a presence so commanding that the armed man simply stopped walking and stared. When the chief spoke, his words carried the authority of someone who had never been conquered, only murdered. "This mountain is the resting place of my people," Chief Tenaya said, his voice resonating with spiritual power that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Every stone, every tree, every grain of soil is sacred to us. You will not pass." The contractor raised his weapon, but found that his hands were trembling too violently to aim. Around him, other armed men were discovering that their equipment was becoming impossibly heavy, their tactical gear weighing them down as if gravity itself had intensified in their immediate vicinity. Agent Martinez was recording everything while coordinating with the Miwok tribal authorities, who had now established a perimeter around Hartwell's forces. "This is unprecedented," she reported to her headquarters. "The spiritual manifestations are demonstrating direct physical intervention capabilities that exceed any documented paranormal phenomena." But it was Luna who understood what was really happening. Standing safely in the hotel lobby with Victoria's protective spirit beside her, she explained to her father what the ancestors were showing her. "Papa, they're not fighting the bad people the way living people fight. They're showing them the truth about what they've done, and the guilt is making them too weak to continue." Daniel watched in amazement as Hartwell's contractors began lowering their weapons and backing away from the hotel. But they weren't retreating in fear. They were withdrawing in what appeared to be growing horror and shame, as if they were suddenly seeing their actions from a completely different perspective. "The spirits are sharing their memories," Victoria explained, her ghostly form now radiating an energy that was both gentle and inexorable. "Every person who approaches with violent intent experiences the full emotional impact of our people's suffering. They feel what it was like to be murdered for protecting sacred places. They understand the pain of watching their children die from poisoned water. They experience the grief of seeing their ancestors, graves desecrated for gold." The psychological effect on Hartwell's forces was devastating and immediate. Men who had been prepared to commit violence in exchange for money found themselves overwhelmed by the accumulated sorrow and injustice of 145 years. Some were openly weeping as they walked away from their equipment. Others were removing their tactical gear and throwing it on the ground as if it had become contaminated. But Jonathan Hartwell himself seemed to be experiencing something different. As his hired forces abandoned their positions, he was moving toward the hotel with increasing determination, his face set in an expression of desperate fury that suggested he was beyond rational thought. "He's not feeling guilt like the others," Luna observed, studying Hartwell's approach with concern. "Victoria says some people's hearts are so hard that they can't feel other people's pain anymore. The ancestors' memories just make him angry instead of sorry." Agent Martinez was tracking Hartwell's advance while maintaining communication with federal authorities who were finally responding to the crisis. "Command, I need immediate aerial support. The primary suspect is approaching the protected site with apparent intent to commit violence against federal witnesses." But the response from her headquarters carried news that changed the entire strategic situation. "Martinez, be advised that federal warrants have been issued for Jonathan Hartwell and 12 associates based on evidence of cultural artifact trafficking and conspiracy to commit murder. You are authorized to use whatever force necessary to prevent destruction of evidence or harm to witnesses." The legal tide had finally turned, but Hartwell was now close enough to the hotel that Luna could see his face clearly through the windows. His expression was that of someone who had abandoned all pretense of civilization, a man who had decided that if he couldn't have the treasure, he would ensure that no one else could either. "Mr. Garcia," Hartwell called out as he approached the hotel's front entrance, "I want you to understand something. My family has invested over a century in this operation. We've bribed judges, eliminated witnesses, and destroyed entire communities to reach this moment. I will not be stopped by parlor tricks and superstitious nonsense." But as Hartwell stepped onto the hotel's front porch, he encountered something that even his hardened conscience couldn't dismiss. Victoria Whitmore materialized directly in front of him, no longer translucent but solid enough to cast shadows, her 19-year-old face bearing the accumulated wisdom and pain of 145 years spent seeking justice. "Hello, Jonathan," she said with heartbreaking gentleness. "I'm Victoria Whitmore. Your great-great-grandfather murdered me on September 15, 1879, to cover up your family's crimes. I've been waiting all this time to meet you." The confrontation between Hartwell and Victoria was unlike anything Daniel had ever witnessed. It wasn't a battle between good and evil in any dramatic sense, but rather a moment of absolute moral clarity, where pretense became impossible and truth demanded acknowledgement. Hartwell stared at Victoria for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and something that might have been recognition. "You're not real. Dead people don't come back to have conversations." "Yet here I am," Victoria replied with infinite patience. "And here you are, continuing the work your ancestor began. Tell me, Jonathan, do you ever wonder what kind of man you might have been if your family hadn't built its fortune on murder and theft?" The question seemed to hit Hartwell like a physical blow. For the first time since arriving at the hotel, his mask of corporate confidence cracked completely, revealing something desperate and lost underneath. "I didn't choose this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was born into it. The mining operations, the legal cover-ups, the pressure to maintain the family business. It was all there before I was old enough to understand what it meant." Victoria's expression softened with something approaching compassion. "I know. Your great-great-grandfather was born into it too, in a different way. The pressure to succeed, to prove himself worthy, to accumulate wealth and power no matter the cost. But at some point, each generation has the choice to continue the pattern or break it." Luna was watching the interaction with fascination, her notebook forgotten, as she witnessed something that seemed more like a spiritual counseling session than a confrontation between enemies. "Victoria is trying to save him," she whispered to her father. "She's showing him that he can choose to be different." But the moment of potential redemption was interrupted by the arrival of FBI helicopters and federal tactical teams, who had finally received authorization to intervene directly. The sound of rotors filled the air as Agent Martinez's backup arrived in force, transforming the intimate spiritual confrontation into a law enforcement operation. "Jonathan Hartwell," a voice boomed from the helicopter's speakers, "you are under arrest for federal charges of cultural artifact trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and destruction of protected Native American sites. Surrender immediately." Hartwell looked up at the helicopters, then back at Victoria, his face showing a man caught between impossible choices. Behind him, his abandoned contractors were being taken into custody by federal agents, while tribal representatives were securing the sacred artifacts that had been hidden for 145 years. The final moment of the confrontation would determine whether Hartwell chose redemption or destruction, and whether 145 years of injustice could finally end with something approaching peace, rather than simply victory. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the grand ballroom of what was now officially known as the Victoria Whitmore Cultural Preservation Center, watching his daughter Luna guide a group of Miwok children through the sacred artifact collection that had been restored to its rightful place. The transformation had been extraordinary. What had once been a decaying hotel haunted by injustice was now a thriving cultural center, where the living and the dead worked together to heal wounds that had festered for 145 years. The legal resolution had moved with unprecedented speed once Victoria's evidence reached federal prosecutors. Jonathan Hartwell had ultimately chosen cooperation over destruction, his tearful confession to federal agents revealing a network of cultural crimes that stretched across 7 states and involved dozens of prominent families. The $195 million value of the returned artifacts had been dwarfed by the additional recoveries from Hartwell properties throughout the region, ultimately returning over $800 million worth of stolen cultural treasures to their rightful tribal communities. But the most remarkable aspect of the center wasn't its legal victory or financial impact. It was the ongoing collaboration between the Miwok people and the spirits of their ancestors. Victoria Whitmore had chosen to remain as the center's spiritual guardian, her ghostly presence now a comforting rather than sorrowful fixture in the building's daily operations. Dr. Garcia called Dr. Maria Santos, the center's director of cultural preservation. "The morning session is ready for your presentation." Daniel smiled at the title that still felt strange to him. The University of California had granted him an honorary doctorate in cultural restoration, recognizing his role in uncovering and preserving the largest intact collection of Miwok artifacts in existence. But more importantly, He'd found his true calling in helping bridge the gap between academic research and spiritual truth. The morning session was a weekly tradition, a gathering where tribal elders, academic researchers, and spiritual leaders shared knowledge about Miwok history and culture. But what made these sessions unique was the active participation of ancestral spirits who provided first-hand accounts of historical events that had previously been lost to time. Luna, now 14 and serving as the center's primary spiritual interpreter, had developed remarkable abilities that went far beyond simple communication with ghosts. She could facilitate complex conversations between the living and the dead, helping resolve historical mysteries and heal generational trauma through direct dialogue with those who had experienced it. "Good morning, everyone," Daniel began, addressing an audience that included living researchers, Miwok tribal members, and several translucent figures who materialized as the session began. Today we're continuing our discussion of the ceremonial significance of the golden eagle headdress that was recovered from the hotel's hidden chamber. Chief Tanaya's spirit stepped forward, his presence as commanding in death as it had been in life. "The headdress was created by my grandfather's grandfather for the ceremony that connects our people to the mountain spirits. It was never meant to be owned by any individual, but to serve as a bridge between the earthly and spiritual realms." Dr. Santos took careful notes while simultaneously recording the session for the Smithsonian's archives. The federal government had established the center as a model for how cultural preservation could incorporate both scientific methodology and indigenous spiritual practices, creating a new standard for collaboration between institutions and tribal communities. But the center's work extended far beyond academic research. In the past 6 months, it had become a pilgrimage site for Native American families seeking to reconnect with ancestors who had been lost to historical trauma. The building's unique spiritual properties allowed for healing conversations that had been impossible for generations. "Mrs. Martinez," Luna said gently to an elderly woman who had traveled from Arizona, "your great-grandmother wants you to know that she's proud of how you've raised your family to remember the old ways, even when it was difficult." The woman began crying as a ghostly figure materialized beside her, a Miwok woman in traditional dress who had died in the 1920s but had been waiting decades for the chance to speak with her descendants. These reunions had become the center's most profound contribution to healing historical wounds. Victoria Whitmore appeared beside Luna, her presence now radiating peace rather than the sorrow that had defined her for 145 years. "Daniel, there's something I want to show you," she said, gesturing toward the hotel's restored third floor. They climbed the grand staircase that had been beautifully restored using traditional materials and methods. The third floor, once damaged by fire and sealed by shame, was now the center's museum space, displaying the complete story of what had happened to the Miwok people and how justice had finally been served. But Victoria led them to a new addition that Daniel hadn't seen before, a memorial wall bearing the names and photographs of everyone who had died protecting sacred sites throughout California. The list was staggering in its length, representing not just the original victims from the 1870s, but continuing through to modern activists who had given their lives defending indigenous rights. "This is why the center matters," Victoria said softly. "Not just because we recovered stolen treasures or exposed historical crimes, but because we proved that love and justice can transcend death itself. Every person on this wall is still fighting for their people, still working to protect what's sacred." Luna was studying a section of the memorial dedicated to children who had died in the cultural genocide campaigns. "Victoria, will you and the other ancestors always stay here?" Victoria smiled with the wisdom of someone who had learned that death was transformation rather than ending. "Some of us will move on to whatever comes next, knowing that our work is finished. Others will remain to guide and protect this place. But the choice is ours now, rather than being trapped by unfinished business." The afternoon brought a delegation from the United Nations, part of an international effort to establish similar cultural preservation centers around the world. The Victoria Whitmore model was being studied as a template for addressing historical injustices while incorporating indigenous spiritual practices into modern institutional frameworks. Mr. Garcia, the UN representative, said as they toured the facility, "What you've accomplished here challenges every assumption about the relationship between legal justice and spiritual healing. How do we replicate this elsewhere?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I think the key is understanding that some truths can't be accessed through conventional methods. When we opened ourselves to spiritual guidance, we didn't abandon scientific rigor. we expanded it to include forms of evidence that Western institutions have traditionally dismissed. As evening approached, the center's daily operations wound down, but the spiritual activity continued. Families gathered in the ballroom for healing ceremonies led by tribal elders, while researchers worked late into the night documenting oral histories shared by ancestral spirits who remembered events from centuries past. Luna found her father on the hotel's restored veranda, looking out over the mountain that had been returned to its rightful spiritual guardians. "Papa, do you think Mama would be proud of what we've built here?" Daniel felt a familiar warmth that had become his constant companion since the center's establishment. "Mija, your mother visits here regularly. She's told me herself how proud she is of the woman you're becoming and the work we're doing together." As if summoned by his words, Elena's spirit materialized beside them, her presence filling the evening air with love and approval. "I told you beautiful things could happen even after the worst days," she said softly. "You've created something that will help families heal for generations to come." The stars were emerging overhead as the 3 generations of the Garcia family, living and dead, sat together on the veranda of a building that had been transformed from a monument to injustice into a beacon of hope. Around them, the mountain pulsed with spiritual energy as dozens of ancestral guardians maintained their eternal watch over the sacred places they had died protecting. In the distance, lights from Raven's Peak showed a community that had been transformed as well. The corrupt officials had been replaced by people committed to justice, the mining scars were being healed through restoration projects, and the town had become a destination for people seeking to understand how historical wounds could be healed through truth and reconciliation. The Victoria Whitmore Cultural Preservation Center would continue its work, bridging worlds and healing trauma while proving that some secrets are indeed worth dying for, and that the most important ones are worth living for too. Love, it turned out, was indeed the most powerful force in any universe, strong enough to transcend death and transform even the deepest injustices into opportunities for redemption and growth. Tomorrow would bring new families seeking healing, new researchers documenting forgotten histories, and new proof that when the living and the dead work together with respect and love, even the most impossible dreams can become reality. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.